Good evening, lover of dark stories. Did you come for the story? Or did the story come for you? If you're here, it's because you like stories that stick in your head, right? The ones that haunt you in the silence of the night, that make you question just how far reality goes, and what truly resides beyond what you can see. Well then, get ready. The story today will stay with you for a long time. Perhaps you'll never look at the dark the same way again. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and activate the bell. Put on your headphones and let yourself be enveloped by every word. And remember, when you start listening to a story like this, it has the power to find you when you least expect it. Stay alert. After all, you never know when the shadows decide to show their face. The sun had already set a few hours ago when I found myself in the field. The cold autumn wind cut through my skin, and the fog began to take over the cornfield. In the distance, the feet of the scarecrows were barely visible, as if the field itself were trying to hide what it was meant to protect. The cornfield was silent, but in a strange way. It was as if it was waiting for something ... or someone. I grew up hearing stories about that place, stories told by the older people in the neighboring town. They always talked about the Scarecrow, something sinister that took over those lands, but I never believed it. I was young, skeptical, and thought it was just superstition. No one had ever really disappeared, right? It was all just stories. I was wrong. You probably wouldn't believe it, but people started disappearing there, one by one, without explanation. Entire families that ventured into the field were never seen again. Some said it was the Scarecrow. Others spoke of something deeper, darker. I decided I needed to see it with my own eyes, to uncover the truth. At first, the disappearances seemed normal. People lost, maybe dead, who knows? Until something began to change. I heard reports that those who entered the cornfield never came out. But the strangest part wasn't the disappearances themselves. It was what happened before. The testimonies spoke of muffled laughter, of dragging footsteps, as if they were being watched by something or someone without ever being seen. That's why, on that night, I decided to investigate on my own. I knew no one would come with me. I was already aware that, to them, I was just another madman trying to unearth the secrets of the past. But that didn't stop me. There was something in that place calling to me, something pushing me into the cornfield, as if it were inevitable. The field seemed larger than I remembered. The crops stretched out as far as the eye could see. The darkness seemed to swallow any sound that tried to escape from that place. When I walked into the center of the cornfield, something settled within me. A chill, a feeling that things were out of place, as if time and space no longer made sense. It was then that I saw it for the first time. The Scarecrow. It was closer than I imagined, standing in the middle of the field with its arms outstretched, as if waiting for me. Its eyes, made of buttons, seemed to stare at me intensely. I stopped, feeling the weight of what was happening. How could a simple scarecrow, made of straw and rags, make me feel such a visceral sensation? I moved forward because something inside me told me this was what I needed to understand. As I got closer, the scarecrow seemed to move, not physically, but somehow, invisibly, as if its very presence was altering the reality around me. The soft breeze seemed to become heavier, denser. I smelled the wet earth, but also another odor. Something rotten. I looked around, but saw nothing. That's when I realized the scarecrow was farther away than I had thought, and that the cornfield stretched out into an endless maze. The field was swallowing me. I was inside it now. But what unsettled me more wasn't the field itself, or the scarecrow. It was the growing feeling that something was watching me. As if the very cornfields, the earth, the scarecrows, everything was watching my every step. Have you ever felt that? A sense that you're not alone anymore? It was as if the air was thicker, as if everything was about to move. I tried to turn around, find an escape path, but when I looked back at the scarecrow, it was no longer there. In its place, a shadow, a silhouette, seemed to move through the leaves. I couldn't breathe properly, and fear began to consume me. I was no longer in control. The feeling of desperation wrapped around me like an invisible web. I was trapped. By this point, you must be wondering if all of this is real. If this isn't just a story created by my mind. I wondered that too. But as you'll see, what happens next will make you question whether what you see is truly what exists. The cornfield, the scarecrow, the curse. All of it is part of something bigger, more terrible than you can imagine. The scarecrow was no longer in sight, but the weight of its presence seemed to linger in the air, like an invisible burden. I felt watched, surveilled, and the trees around me began to whisper, their leaves moving against the breeze, but the wind made no sound. This made me even more uneasy. Something was very wrong here. The field, once familiar, now seemed like an alien place, a labyrinth of shadows and currents of air moving in inexplicable ways. I knew I couldn't trust what my eyes were seeing. Darkness was taking over, but something inside me told me to move forward, as if the cornfield itself was calling me to uncover what was hidden between the leaves and stalks of the plants. With each step I took, the sounds grew more intense. It wasn't the sound of the leaves moving in the wind. It wasn't a normal wind. I could hear the rustling of dry stalks, the sound of something being dragged through the shadows. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, but no matter how much I tried to rationalize the situation, the tension kept rising. And then I heard it, a muffled laugh. A sound so low, it seemed to blend with the wind. But it wasn't. It raced, and I stopped. The laugh silenced for a moment, but the feeling that something was there, close to me, only intensified. It's just a trick of my mind. I tried to convince myself, but even I knew it didn't make sense. I was in an abandoned field, in the middle of the night, and the feeling that the darkness was alive wrapped around me like a cold, tight cloak. I tried to walk faster, searching for a way out, but the path seemed always the same, the rows of corn stretching ahead of me, as if I were trapped in a nightmare. I could smell the wet earth, mixed with something else, something unbearable, as if something was rotting beneath the soil. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath my feet, and I stumbled, falling to my knees. The earth seemed to shift. I looked down and saw something, a pair of glowing eyes, fixed on me, reflecting the faint light of the moon. I quickly got up, but what I saw next paralyzed me. Between the corn stalks, the scarecrow was back, closer than I ever imagined, now with eyes. Alive, they stared at me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. They weren't sewn buttons. Now, they were human eyes, still with that macabre gleam, as if something had infiltrated those pieces of straw and taken control. I knew, at that moment, that I wasn't dealing with a mere scarecrow. It was more than that, more than just a straw. Statue meant to scare the crows. I started to back away, my mind racing to find an explanation, any explanation. But the more I tried to move away, the more the scarecrow seemed to approach, its stiff arms outstretched toward me, as if calling me, drawing me closer. The field began to close in around me, the plants moving in a strange way, as if they were alive. The distance between us shrank with each passing second, and I could feel its presence in every fiber of my skin. That's when I realized I was no longer alone. I could feel eyes watching me, not just from the scarecrow, but from the entire field. The shadows of the plants seemed to take on shapes, human-like outlines, figures moving between the leaves, lurking, waiting. Every step I took was followed. Every breath of mine seemed to echo in the vast silence of the cornfield. With every movement I made, the earth beneath my feet shifted. It wasn't a normal movement, like the earth was shaping itself to trap me. I was inside a living place, and it was slowly swallowing me. When I looked up, the sky seemed different, heavier, as if the sky itself was watching with invisible eyes. Suddenly, a peculiar sound cut through the stillness of the field. A distant sound, but unmistakable. It was a scream. Not a human scream, but something that sounded like an echo of something very ancient. The scream came from deep within the field, somewhere beyond the thick fog, beyond the plants. I knew that whatever was there, it wasn't something I should be searching for, but at the same time, something inside me urged me to go toward the sound. It couldn't be that, could it? The scarecrow was calling me, or maybe it was something else. The scream seemed like a threat disguised as a cry for help, an irresistible pull. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity won over fear. The scarecrow watched every movement I made, and I knew I couldn't stand still. If I stopped, I would be consumed by that presence, that entity hovering over the field. I moved forward, driven by a force I didn't understand. My steps echoed in the field, an empty sound answered only by the silence of the shadows. I was going deeper into the cornfield, and the feeling of being guided by something malevolent intensified. Are you starting to realize what I saw that night? The feeling that the field was more than just a simple plantation? Something was happening there, something that went beyond what any human mind could comprehend. And I was getting closer to the truth. But what I would find there, you still don't know. The field seemed to expand around me, and the fog, thick and dense, enveloped me as if it were a web. Each movement I made slower and more difficult than the last. The air was heavier, almost impossible to breathe, and the feeling of being watched grew with each step. I didn't know where I was going, but some invisible force was pushing me in one direction, as if I were being guided by unseen hands toward a destination I didn't want to reach. The scream I had heard earlier still echoed in my mind, and as I moved forward, it seemed to intensify. It was no longer a cry for help. It was a lament, deep and filled with pain. But at the same time, it seemed to be calling me, urging me to go deeper. I didn't know if I was getting closer to the end, or to something much worse. With each step, the field grew darker. The leaves of the corn plants now seemed to bend toward me, as if they were watching me, as if the corn itself had a consciousness. It was a strange feeling, as if the field were an extension of my own mind, and I was being forced to confront something I didn't even know existed. That's when I saw it again, the scarecrow. It was there, standing in the middle of the cornfield. But now something was different. It looked more human. The figure that had once been made of straw and rags now seemed to have a life of its own. The tattered clothes that covered it were moving, as if an invisible wind was stirring them. And the eyes, those eyes that had once been buttons, were now alive. Human eyes, filled with malice and suffering. I froze. I didn't know whether to run, stay, or simply surrender to whatever was chasing me. It was as if the scarecrow itself had become a reflection of my mind, of my worst form of fear and anguish. I knew I couldn't escape. The field wouldn't let me. It was already trapping me, and the feeling that I was being manipulated by something beyond my comprehension grew clearer with each passing second. Suddenly, a cold breeze cut through the air, and the scarecrow moved. Not in a way that a normal scarecrow would move. It wasn't the mechanical movement of a straw doll being pushed by the wind. It moved like a human, slowly, as if it were approaching me in a calculated way, as if it knew exactly what I was thinking. I could hear its steps. They were quiet, but clear. clear, like a muffled sigh. And then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here," it said in a hissing, hoarse voice, full of rancor. It wasn't the type of voice I expected from a scarecrow. It was a human voice, distorted by evil. I instinctively backed away, but something in the field seemed to keep me in place. Each step I took toward escape was followed by a growing sensation that the scarecrow was getting closer. As if the space between us was shrinking with every movement I made. I was trapped in a snare, and the leaves around me whispered, as if they were laughing at my situation. "What are you?" I asked, my voice sounding weaker than I imagined. I knew there would be no satisfactory answer, but the curiosity, the need to understand, made me ask. It tilted its head, as if it were going to come closer. Its eyes glowed with an unusual intensity, and I could feel it feeding on my fear. "I am what you stopped believing in," it replied, its voice sounding as if it were coming from all corners of the field at once. "I am what you ignored, what you rejected. But now you are here, and there's no turning back." The feeling of panic overwhelmed me in an all-consuming way. The fear I felt was no longer about the scarecrow itself, but about what it represented, what it had become. It was no longer just a cursed scarecrow. It was the manifestation of something more, something much bolder and deeper, that was hiding in that field. Something I could no longer ignore. And then, as if answering my thoughts, the scarecrow took a step forward. I recoiled, but again, the field wouldn't let me go. The plants seemed to trap me, their leaves scratching at my skin. I was being surrounded once again. And when I looked at the scarecrow, it was no longer in its usual form. It seemed human, but deformed, like a mixture of straw and human flesh. Its arms were long, disproportionate, and its mouth, if you could call it that, open to reveal a gap of sharp teeth, looking more like a monster than a simple scarecrow. "I am the curse," it said, and its voice now sounded like straw being torn. "I am the reason for the disappearances. I am the price you pay for meddling with what you don't understand." I didn't know what it meant by the price, but now the field was no longer just a field. It was a labyrinth of suffering and death, and I was at its center, in a place where reality and nightmare blurred. I tried to run, but an invisible force stopped me. I was being pulled back toward it, toward the scarecrow that was now moving toward me with a speed I didn't believe possible. Its monstrous smile seemed to stretch, as if it were about to swallow me. I was at a crossroads, between death and the unknown. The scarecrow was no longer just a being made of straw. It was a reflection of human fear, guilt, and the desire for power that had corrupted that place. "There's no way out," it hissed. And then, the only thing left for me to do was face the truth. I was paralyzed, immersed in a fear so deep that I could barely distinguish what was real and what was a product of my mind. The scarecrow, now a deformed and monstrous figure, moved with steps that made no sense, as if the earth beneath it was shaping itself to allow its movements. Its hands, long and disproportionate, stretched toward me, and its mouth, a void of sharp, dirty teeth, widened into a macabre smile, as if it were savoring every moment of my anguish. I wanted to run, scream, flee, but something stopped me. It wasn't a physical force, but an overwhelming feeling that the entire field was alive, as if it were absorbing me, trapping me. Every leaf, every ear of corn, seemed to be watching me with invisible eyes. The earth, with its heavy dampness, seemed to cling to me, dragging me down into the darkness. "You think you can escape?" The scarecrow hissed again, but this time it was different. It no longer spoke like an external entity. It was inside my head, invading my thoughts, knowing exactly what I feared. "This field is your prison, and worse, you're part of it now." I wanted to scream. I wanted to understand what was happening, but my throat was tight, my body stiff, as if something inside me had broken. I looked around, searching for any sign of escape, any path that might lead me back to safety. But all I saw was the endless, suffocating cornfield, with the leaves moving in a strange way, almost as if the wind was pushing them differently. The feeling that the field was closing in around me grew stronger with each passing second. "Why? Are you doing this?" I asked, my voice hoarse and trembling. I already knew the answer, but I needed to hear him say it. I needed him to confirm what I already suspected, that this curse was not just about the scarecrow. It was about something much deeper, something rooted in the earth itself. The scarecrow stopped just a few meters away from me. Its grotesque smile now widened, almost as if its mouth had stretched farther than should have been possible. It tilted, its head, observing me with malicious curiosity, as if it were waiting for a reaction. Then, finally, it answered, "Because you came here. Because you unearthed what was buried. You thought you could challenge what is older than your understanding, what you should have never touched. And now you will pay the price. There is no going back." I tried to step away, but it was as if my feet were glued to the ground. I could no longer move. The scarecrow was so close now that I could smell decomposition, a mix of wet straw and something else, something horrible. Its eyes, now human, fixed on me, and there was something in them that I would never forget. A gleam of intelligence, of knowledge, and of an ancient evil that seemed immortal. "You know what this place is, don't you?" It continued, its voice now softer, as if it were telling me a secret. "This field, these crops, they are not just a harvest. They are a veil, a doorway to the other side, where things that don't belong here can feed on the souls of the living." I tried to process its words, but fear and confusion overwhelmed me, as if the field itself were poisoning me with its tale of death and sacrifice. The scarecrow spoke of something I didn't want to understand, Something about sacrifices, about ancient rituals that had been performed there. Something about the earth that needed to be fed with souls, with lives, to maintain the balance between worlds. I am the prison and the key, the Scarecrow continued. I am the guardian of secrets you should have never uncovered. And now, you will be part of the harvest. I felt my legs weaken, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out right there in that cursed field. But before I could fall, the Scarecrow advanced, its long twitching arms wrapping around my body. The cold of death pierced through me. I was being consumed, pulled into something deep, something below the earth. The Scarecrows, as I had seen before, were just the facade. They were the guardians of the harvest, the indicators of a ritual that transcended the physical and rooted itself in something far older. The earth beneath my feet shifted, as if it were alive. An excruciating pain spread through my body, as if my very being were being torn apart from the inside out. And then, darkness completely enveloped me. When I regained my senses, I was back in that field, but something had changed. The air was denser, the ground more solid. I looked at my hands and saw something terrible. I was no longer just observing. I was part of that place. The field now seemed to grow inside me, and the Scarecrow, with its grotesque smile, was by my side. Now you understand, it said, its voice reverberating in my mind. You will never leave here again. Now you are part of the earth, of the story that never ends. You are just another soul to feed the veil. I wanted to scream. I wanted to escape, but I knew there was no more escape. The field, the Scarecrow, the evil that inhabited that place, they were now a part of me. And like the Scarecrow, I too was a guardian of what should never be revealed. And the most terrifying part, I knew that sooner or later, someone else would come. Someone who, like me, would be drawn in by curiosity and fear, and they would be the next victim. The story, in the end, isn't about what happened, but about who or what we become. And it seems there is no going back. The pain didn't stop. The feeling of being trapped, not just physically but mentally, dragged through every part of me. I wanted to fight. I wanted to understand how I had reached this point, but the truth began to settle inside me like a wound. That couldn't be healed. I was no longer outside of the story. I was the story now, and the story had no end. The fields around me seemed to pulse, as if the earth were alive, breathing. The Scarecrow, or what remained of it, was by my side, watching with its deep, empty eyes. It was no longer a simple grotesque figure, made of straw and rags. It now blended with the very essence of the field, as if it were fused to it, in a strange and disturbing symbiosis. You've always been part of this, the Scarecrow said, its voice echoing in my mind, no longer in my ears. You just needed to see. All who enter here, all who discover, have a part to play. I was starting to understand, even though the truth was nearly impossible to digest. This wasn't just about a cursed Scarecrow. It wasn't just about inexplicable deaths, the field, the earth, the Scarecrow. Everything was part of something bigger, something older than any human could comprehend. It was a force that fed on those who dared to invade this place, a force that wove its roots into the very existence. I had been drawn here, like all the others. Perhaps my curiosity was the trigger, or maybe it was my need to understand what was happening. But one thing was clear now. I was in an eternal cycle. Those who disappeared in the cornfield were transformed, shaped by the field. They became part of something that couldn't be described in words. The Scarecrow, with its macabre smile, was the guardian of that transformation. But the most disturbing truth of all was that I, too, had been transformed. The pain in my body was not just physical. It spread into something deeper. I was being absorbed. My essence was being dissolved by the earth itself, by the invisible forces that inhabited this place. I was now a shadow, a soul that had been lost in time. I looked at my hands, and they were beginning to be covered by a thin layer of straw. It wasn't something I could control. It was as if I were becoming part of the field, as if the Scarecrow were recreating me in its own image. I tried to move, tried to resist, but the force of the earth and the field was immense. With every movement, with every breath, my own humanity was slipping away. You will understand, sooner or later, the Scarecrow said, its voice now soft, almost comforting. There's no choice, no escape. All who come here end up losing something. Some lose their mind, others lose their lives. And the luckiest lose everything at once. What I felt in that moment was an indescribable anguish. It wasn't just the fear of death. It was the realization that death, or whatever would come next, was not the end. Not for those trapped in this field. Not for those touched by the curse. I was now part of this cycle, part of this eternal ritual. I felt myself being pulled toward the center of the cornfield. It was no longer a choice. The field was pulling me in like a puppet, its invisible strings guiding me mercilessly. The corn plants bowed to me, and the shadows around me distorted, taking on grotesque shapes, as if the field itself was manifesting physically, swallowing me whole. With each step I took, the field seemed to stretch infinitely. I no longer knew what was real, and what was just a projection of my weakened mind. The Scarecrow was by my side, but at the same time, it seemed to be the earth itself, the field itself. It was in everything, and I, too, was now in everything. When we reached the center, silence took over everything. The field was still, but I could feel the pulse of the earth, a constant, deep beat, like the heartbeat of a living being. The Scarecrow, or whatever it had become, looked at me with its deep eyes. This is where everything begins and ends, it said. You are not the first, and you won't be the last. But all of you field fed, the Scarecrow renewed itself, and those who succumbed to its power became part of a story that never ended. The Scarecrow, now an incomprehensible figure, represented the curse of endless time, a silent condemnation that stretched beyond human understanding. And I, now, was no longer an observer. I was part of it, and who else would come? Who else would fall into the Scarecrow's trap? The cycle would never break, because in the end, the field never stops waiting. I saw in that instant what awaited me, a place without beginning or end, where I and others like me would remain trapped, watching the world pass by without ever truly touching it again. Not in the end. There is only one certainty: the world we see. Maybe it's not all that exists. Comment below what you think, and if you're brave enough, come back here tomorrow. There's always a new story waiting for you. ... But remember ... some stories never end. I didn't know what had broken inside of me, but something deep and definitive had shattered in that moment. The Scarecrow was no longer a looming presence that haunted the fields. It was the field itself, an extension of something that couldn't be understood, only felt. The earth that now enveloped me was a prison, an invisible cell, and I was trapped within it, just like all those who had come before me. I had lost track of how much time had passed. The concept of days, hours, moments seemed to disappear as I merged with the field. I no longer felt the weight of my own flesh. My body, now a mixture of straw, earth, and something undefined, was no longer mine. I felt like I was part of something greater, a force that had infiltrated the roots of the field, the passing winds, the shadows that moved. I was no longer alone. Others were with me, but they were no longer human. They were fragments of the repeating story, souls trapped in an eternal cycle, moving like shadows, like echoes of a past that never dies. I looked around, trying to find something familiar, but the field seemed to stretch on endlessly. The rows of corn, which once seemed like a simple cornfield, now were infinite labyrinths, each one filled with the ghosts of those who had once been like me. The Scarecrow was no longer by my side, or perhaps it was everywhere. The sensation of its presence was in every movement of the field, in the way the leaves moved without wind, in the way the sky seemed darker and more closed than ever before. It was no longer just a figure made of straw, but the very field itself. The earth was breathing, and I felt every breath as if it were my own. But somewhere, deep in my mind, one question persisted. Why me? Why had I been chosen to be part of this curse? I knew I wasn't the first to be consumed by this cycle of horror, but the pain of losing my humanity was overwhelming. And yet, part of me understood. I had no choice. The field, the Scarecrow, the earth. They were the true masters now. I heard footsteps behind me, a presence that made me shudder. I turned quickly, trying to see something, but all I saw was the field. The Scarecrow had returned, but its form was now more than just a figure. It was a presence, a living force. Its eyes, those human and shining eyes, were fixed on me. And once again, it spoke, but its voice didn't come from its lips. It echoed inside my head, inside my being. You still don't understand, do you? It said, its voice deep and full of disdain. The curse is not just about the field. It's not just about the Scarecrow. It's about you. About all who come here and try to escape what is inevitable. I was silent, absorbing its words, trying to understand. It was right. The pain I felt, the sense of being part of something much bigger, much older, was unbearable. And yet, there was one undeniable truth I could not deny. I had chosen to come here. I had sought to understand. I had sought more, and now I was paying the price. The Scarecrow moved slowly toward me, but I didn't move. Something inside me knew. I no longer had control over what was happening. The story, the curse, was already being written. I was no longer a character. I was part of it. Part of something that stretched far beyond time, far beyond what the human mind could comprehend. The earth seemed to open around me. It wasn't a physical movement, but a feeling of falling, as if the ground was pulling away from me. I was being drawn down into the very field itself, where the air was dense and warm, and the sound of the leaves moving transformed into a background melody, almost hypnotic. The field was swallowing me. I felt it, not as pain, but as emptiness. I was being absorbed by the earth, and this was not a death. It was a transformation. I finally understood what the Scarecrow had meant. The curse was not about death. It was about the loss of identity, of soul, of humanity. The earth didn't feed on bodies. It fed on lives, on stories, on everything a human being is. And I, like all those before me, had been consumed by it. I was no longer a person. I was a story, a part of the story of that field. And when the others came, as they always did, they would also be lost. They too would become part of it, because the field always demands a new story. It always asks for a new soul to feed on. The pain was gone. There was no more pain, only stillness. I was inside the earth now, a part of it. And though the field was silent, I knew its story would never end. It would never end. In the end, there is only one certainty. The world we see, maybe it's not all that exists. Comment below what you think. And if you have the courage, come back here tomorrow. There's always a new story waiting for you. ... But remember, some stories never end. I was immersed in a deep silence, but it wasn't an ordinary silence. It was the silence of the earth, a silence that couldn't be described with words, because it was beyond any language I knew. There was no sound, no movement, no time. I was in a state of suspension, where everything I knew, everything I was, seemed to have been erased. replaced by something else, something that transcended death. I no longer knew where my body ended and where the earth began. I was now an extension of everything the field represented, an eternal prison for those who dared to seek more than they should. But there was something strange about this silence, something that made me feel even more lost, as if I were in a limbo between what was real and what was merely a distortion of my mind. I knew that somewhere there was a cycle of lives continuing to repeat, a macabre dance of souls that never found peace. I had been swallowed, like all the others, but the Scarecrow, that horrible being who had become the guardian of the field, was still nearby. It was always there, in every leaf, in every breeze, in every shadow that moved between. The corn plant stopped suddenly. A feeling of movement coursed through my body, and I realized I was being pulled again. Not physically, but in a darker way, as if the field, now fully aware of my presence, was testing me, like a predator examining its prey before devouring it completely. The earth began to stir beneath me, and I felt an increasing pressure on my body, as if being squeezed by an invisible force. And then, as if the field itself had materialized before me, it appeared. The Scarecrow, its form was more grotesque than before. Its eyes, which had once been human, were now empty, as if everything human in it had been ripped away. It no longer needed to move physically to approach. It was everywhere in the field at once, a presence that surrounded me, that dominated me. I couldn't distinguish where it ended and where the field began. It had become an entity that transcended the very concept of space. You're starting to understand, aren't you? It hissed, its voice slithering into my mind. You thought you were a victim, thought you could escape, but now you are part of it, like everyone else. I could no longer react. I felt as if somehow my being was disintegrating, being absorbed by the field, as if my soul were being drawn out, piece by piece. It wasn't pain. It was more like a state of loss, a feeling of being diluted into the whole. I had been consumed, not by death, but by something more cruel, more eternal. I would never be free again. All those who come here have a role to play. You, for example, will be tomorrow's story. You will become part of the legend of the field, a warning to those who still doubt what they cannot see, said the Scarecrow. Its voice reverberated in my head, like an echo of 1,000 stories told around a fire, each one with a final warning. I wanted to scream, but my throat was closed. I wanted to fight, but my body was no longer mine. I was trapped, my mind and spirit becoming part of the earth, part of the story that never ended. But deep down, there was a truth I could no longer ignore. I knew I wasn't the only one here. The field was full of others, lost souls that had been swallowed in the same way. They were everywhere, scattered between the shadows and the leaves, their forms indistinct, their presences only perceived in the gaps between the visible and the invisible, and those who will come. They will always come. The Scarecrow, which was now becoming increasingly indistinguishable from the earth itself, smiled. Or at least, I thought it was a smile. It was hard to say, because its form was constantly changing, as if the field were absorbing it and renewing it at the same time. I was now definitely part of this eternal cycle. My body, my soul, my consciousness, everything was being intertwined with the roots and the winds that passed through that field. There is no end to this, it said, its voice now a whisper in the air. This field never dies. It renews itself. It will always need more souls. And the moment you doubt it, you are already destined to be part of it. I no longer knew who I was, but I knew my existence now had another purpose. I was no longer a victim, nor an observer. I was now part of the field, part of the Scarecrow, part of the story that would repeat itself until the end of time. I was just another warning for those who dared to enter, another soul to be consumed by the earth. And when the others came, when more lives were lost there, the cycle would renew. They would be just another story, another warning for those who still doubt, for those who still don't understand what happens when you meddle what you can't control. In the end, there is only one certainty. The world we see ... maybe. It's not all that exists. Comment below what you think. And if you have the courage, come back here tomorrow. There's always a new story waiting for you ... But remember, some stories never end. I felt as if I were being pulled into a hole, but not a physical hole. It was more like a crack in reality itself, an invisible rift that swallowed me, making my body and soul dissolve into the void. The feeling of being completely absorbed by the earth was not just mental. It was physical, emotional, spiritual. Every part of me distorted, crumbled, and while this was happening, I felt something far more terrifying. I was beginning to lose the ability to think. My brain, once filled with fears and questions, was now becoming foggy, as if it were being drained by the very essence of the field. The Scarecrow was no longer by my side. Now, it was the field. It was the wind passing through the leaves, the shadow stretching in the dark nights. I didn't need to see it to feel its presence. It was everywhere. I was inside it, and it was inside me, a fusion that made me question what reality really was. It was as if time and space were bending around me. I no longer knew whether I was still in the cornfield or if I had been transported to another place, a place where the laws of nature no longer applied. The field was alive, breathing and expanding, and I was part of it, an extension of its roots, a part of its ancient memory. You're starting to see, said the Scarecrow, its voice. Now a whisper around me. It wasn't a voice in my ears, but in my mind. You thought you could escape, thought you could leave this cycle. But the field renews itself, and those who enter it never leave. I didn't know anymore if what I felt was fear, regret, or acceptance. I just knew that inside me, a part of my humanity still fought, tried to remember who I was, where I came from, but the struggle was diminishing, becoming weaker. The field had an irresistible force, and the more I tried to cling to my identity, the more it slipped away, like dry leaves being carried by the wind. I tried to think, to remember, something ... anything, but the memories began to jumble. The past mixed with the present, and with something beyond me. I began to feel the roots of the field extending inside my mind, as if the field itself were taking control of my consciousness. "You know what this place is now, don't you?" said the Scarecrow. Its voice was filled with a near sadistic satisfaction. "This field is not just a field. It's the entrance and the exit. It is the memory. It is the prison. And the most terrifying part is that everyone who comes here becomes part of it. Every soul that disappears ... becomes part of the cycle. And now, so are you." What it said was true. I knew that. The Scarecrow, that being of straw and darkness, was no longer just an entity. It was a force, a guardian of something that extended beyond human comprehension. The field wasn't a physical place. It was a dimension, a separate existence, where the rules of the world we know no longer applied. And now, I was part of it. The most terrifying, the most macabre thing of all, was that I knew what would come next. The cycle would renew. Others would come. They would be drawn in by the same curiosity that had led me here. They would also get lost. And then, they too would become part of this field. A part of the stories that never end, of souls that are absorbed by the earth. I knew this. I knew that, like all those before me, I would be forgotten, but my essence would never disappear. The idea of being forgotten wasn't terrifying. What terrified me was that the field didn't care who you were before. There was no room for identity here. There was no room for redemption. The field simply took whatever it wanted and discarded what remained. I was no longer a person. I was no longer a name, a memory. I was part of the field, a shadow, a forgotten memory in the earth. And as I lost myself more and more in the darkness, a part of me began to accept it. The fear was fading, the pain dissipating, until I no longer knew who I had been. I no longer felt human emotions, nor the desire to escape. The earth, the Scarecrow, the field, they were now my essence. They were my reason for being . It was when the Scarecrow appeared before me once again. But this time, its form was no longer that of a human, or even a straw entity. It was everywhere, in every piece of earth, in every leaf that moved. It was the force of the field. It was the field. I was in its presence, and there was no escape. "Now you understand," it said. "The field is not just about what is here. It's about what is between worlds. It's what keeps everything in balance. It is the link between what was and what will be. And now, you are part of that balance. And there will never be separation again." I no longer felt fear nor pain. I felt nothing. Only the presence of the field and the Scarecrow. Everything. Merging into a single reality, where I was no longer a person, but something greater, something eternal, something formless. In the end, there is only one certainty. The world we see. Maybe it's not all that exists. Comment below what you think, and if you have the courage, come back here tomorrow. There's always a new story waiting for you. But remember, some stories never end. I no longer knew whether my eyes were open or closed. Time no longer existed for me. The sensation of being in the field was no longer an experience. I was the field, the Scarecrow, the shadows that moved between the corn plants. There was no longer a separation between what was me and what was the place. Everything had merged into a single existence, an existence that transcended the reality I knew. I no longer needed to think. I no longer needed to question what had happened to me, or what would happen. The field had already taken over every cell of my being. It was as if I were a shadow of what I once was, a memory of a human being who no longer existed. The Scarecrow, or what it represented, was everywhere, guiding, watching, keeping the cycle intact, eternal. I could feel the other souls, those that had been swallowed by this field before me, scattered all around. They were no longer people. They were fragments of stories, pieces of lives that had been consumed and had become part of the cycle that never stops. They were here, around me, but at the same time, they were not. They were only echoes, memories of lives that had been erased by the force of this place. But the Scarecrow was still there. It had always been. It was the key to the cycle, the guardian of the field. I didn't know if it was watching me, or if it was simply the manifestation of the earth itself. I didn't know what it wanted from me, or what it wanted from the others who would come. It was the central point of everything, the reason why. This cycle repeated itself. Amidst all of this, a new feeling emerged, something I hadn't expected. A feeling that the cycle was about to renew itself again. The field, the earth, the Scarecrow, they were ready to accept more. More souls. More stories. More lives that would be consumed to maintain the eternal balance. I knew the others would come, just as I had, and that, just like me, they would be consumed, made part of this place that had no beginning or end. But the most terrifying thing of all was that I no longer felt the weight of being a lost soul. I no longer felt the fear of being consumed. I had been completely absorbed by the field, and there was no going back. The idea of time, of the future, of destiny, no longer made sense. What was real? What was left of me? I didn't know, but I knew that the story would continue, as it always had, without interruption, without end. The Scarecrow, with its human eyes that once reflected the cruelty of a conscious being, now seemed to look at me differently. It was no longer a threat, no longer an enemy. It was the very essence of the field, and I was just a part of it. It no longer needed to speak to me. It knew I understood. There was nothing more to say. The field, in its vastness, had already consumed me completely. And as the shadows stretched across the field, and the stars in the sky faded one by one, I knew something else was coming. I was no longer concerned. I felt nothing but the emptiness that filled my soul. The field was at peace now, waiting for the next story, the next soul that would come to it. It was already preparing for another cycle. Now you are part of me, the Scarecrow's voice said one last time, soft and full of indescribable power. You are part of the story. And like all stories, you will be remembered. But at the same time, you will never truly be remembered. You will be just another legend, another soul consumed by the earth. I could no longer question. There were no more questions. There was nothing more. The cycle would continue, and the earth, the Scarecrow, the field, all of it would continue, waiting for more souls, more stories. I was now part of it, and somehow, I knew this would be forever. In the end, there is only one certainty. The world we see ... Maybe it's not all that exists. Comment below what you think, and if you have the courage, come back here tomorrow. There's always a new story waiting for you ... But remember, some stories never end. The field continued, its imposing and constant presence, like an expanse stretching beyond what human eyes could comprehend. It was infinite and eternal, and I, now lost in its vastness, was just another particle in its story. I didn't know how long I had been there. I didn't know how many cycles had passed. The field didn't allow time to be measured. It didn't need clocks or marks on the calendar. Time existed differently there. It was a fluid force, distorting and stretching according to the will of the earth, according to the whims of the Scarecrow and the souls that passed through it. And now, I was part of it, with no hope of escape, no desire to return. But something began to change. I could feel it. The field, which once seemed so constant, began to vibrate, as if something was about to happen. The leaves swayed more intensely. The wind began to carry a whisper that wasn't natural. I looked to the shadows, and that's when I saw them. Other figures, shadows moving between the plants, appeared. They weren't the old souls, those already lost in the cycle. They were new figures who, like me, had been drawn in by curiosity, by mystery, by fear. They were arriving, more lives that would be consumed by the earth. And the Scarecrow, it was there, at the center of the field, as it had always been. But now it was no longer just a shadowy figure, a threatening presence. It was the very manifestation of the curse, the point of convergence between what was and what would come. It watched, relentless, every new being that arrived in the field. It knew what would happen next. It knew the cycle would renew, that more souls would be collected. The feeling of terror that had once consumed me had disappeared. I no longer felt fear. I felt nothing. The field, the earth, the Scarecrow, they were everything. I was no longer a lost soul. I was part of the story, part of the field. But I knew, somewhere deep inside me, that there was something more. Something deeper, something that neither the Scarecrow nor I could understand. Something that kept it all in motion. The presence of the new lost souls in the field began to intensify. I could feel their struggle, their attempts to escape. I could hear their muffled screams, though there was no real sound, only the echo of their fears and desperation. They were arriving, and as always, the cycle would begin again. I was at peace. I was at peace because it no longer mattered what would come. It didn't matter who would be next, or what would happen to them. I knew that, within the field, stories always renew. The Scarecrow had always been there, and it always waited. There is no end, it said, its voice echoing in the air, but no longer like a whisper. It was a statement, simple and direct. The field always needs more stories. It always needs more souls, and now, you are part of it. I didn't know what remained of me, but I knew that the horror story that had once begun with my curiosity, with my desire to understand the mystery, would become a legend. I would become a memory, a story told to those who would still dare to enter this cursed field. And then, a new cycle would begin. More souls would come. More stories would be consumed. And so, the earth would continue to feed. The Scarecrow would wait for the next victim, and the field would never cease. It was the Scarecrow's story, and it had no end. In the end, there is only one certainty. The world we see ... Maybe it's not all that exists. Comment below what you think, and if you have the courage, come back here tomorrow. There's always a new story waiting for you ... But remember, some stories never end. Pergantar, a ChatGPT.